Hello, good evening. I hope you're doing well, and I would like to thank you for joining me as we take our first step into a solo campaign that I actually technically started a while back whenever we were looking at how to create a character in Stars Without Number. And I've had a lot going on with work and things like this, and so doing my single player solo campaign is kind of taking a back seat. However, things are finally starting to settle down a little bit, and I've had a little bit of time to where I've been able to sit down and kind of come up with this campaign that I'd like to try and play through. So far, the campaign has been super fun. I've been really enjoying it, and the way that I'm going to do it uh, is that I will actually give a video that is more of a storytelling of instead of me playing the game live. And the reason I want to do that is because I feel like if any of you guys actually do end up watching this, that it would be much more enjoyable to actually have the game and the campaign play out as if I'm telling a story, as opposed to me looking through rules and bringing up dice rollers and trying to figure out what I should put where and how I should handle different things. So my goal with it is that I'll actually do the playthrough ahead of time to get my dice rolls, things like this, and kind of how the characters play out and the different events play out, and then I will essentially recite them to you in story form. So that's at least my goal, and a few other things. Of course, the campaign is going to be primarily based off Stars Without Number, my own version of the universe for Stars Without Number. I also will take. I'll be borrowing from Mothership, only sort of. I'm going to try and do a stress system as well, just to add to some of the tension. And also, I'm going to I'm going to actually borrow from the Worlds Without Number healing a little bit, but more on that to come. So, yeah, let's dig into it. So our story begins not in the Milky Way galaxy, but in the Andromeda galaxy, in the Thoran Epsilon sector, on a planet called Thorun. So prior to the Scream, Thorun was the prison world for the entire Andromeda galaxy. So what that meant was that there was an enormous population of prisoners on this planet whenever the Scream happened. And the Scream in my game happened about a little over 1,000 years ago. And my world is technically much more broader in scope. Sorry, my universe is technically much more broader in scope than Stars Without Numbers original rules. It's more like a 40K type game as far as the universe goes. Anyhow, so now we are on the planet Thorun, and after well over 1,000 years, the planet is definitely not the same that it was prior to the Scream. The planet itself is actually a series of biospheres that are all interconnected in different directions and in different ways by what many people on the planet refer to as tubes. So these tubes are essentially glass pipes that connect the different biospheres, and the reason that they connect these biospheres is that these biospheres are the only way to live on this planet for any long period of time. Now, you don't immediately die if exposed to the atmosphere here on Thorun, but if you have sustained exposure for a significant period of time, you will witness permanent damage to your body and definitely eventually death. So escaping from this prison world is really not an option. Whenever it was a prison back in the day, but now it's not really a prison as we would probably refer to it. However, the inhabitants are definitely still trapped there. One of the side effects of the scream was that this planet definitely was severed from the rest of the galaxy, and most assuredly from the homeworlds back in the Milky Way galaxy. And because of that, um, many of the guards on this planet recognized that, number one, they couldn't live without the help of the prisoners, and so we're not really sure exactly how it all went down. But over the course of over 1,000 years, some societies formed within these biospheres. Intertrading between the biospheres occurred. Technology, although it went back in time for the most part, there are some skilled artisans that were able to salvage a lot of the technology and use it and continue to use it even to this day. So it wasn't really like going back into the Middle Ages per se, but definitely the population took a major hit. Prior to the Scream, there was a significant amount of prisoners. My notes show over 150 million prisoners that were housed on this planet. I would probably say, and this is a little bit meta, I guess, but I would probably say that there's less than 1 million people living on the planet now. So, as we continue with the story, we find ourselves in the northwest hemisphere of Thorun in a biosphere that is housed by the Hanakles tribe. Our story centers on the Hanakles tribe, and within this sphere there is actually 6 towns. Primary among them, and where our story begins, is the High Hanuk town. So High Hanuk is sort of assembled in the center, or situated in the center. It's built around the prison, the old prison. Much of the electronics over 1,000 years ago are still functioning today because of those skilled artisans, as well as brave explorers who search for replacement items in the ruins of other biospheres that are scattered throughout the room. The Hanakles have been more fortunate than most, but definitely are not considered the most powerful tribe on Thorun. The current leader of Hanakles is Chief Hansel the Just. With a fitting name, Chief Hansel has ruled his tribe through relative peace and prosperity. Trade with 4 neighboring tribes has meant that food and components have flowed freely and kept the lights on. In fact, a sort of confederation between the 5 friendly tribes in the northwest hemisphere of Thorun has meant that all of the tribespeople in their region live in relative safety. Safety may be the wrong word here, as beasts and bandits still mean that anyone leaving the biospheres are taking their own lives in their hands. Although the Hanakles tribe have grown accustomed to their stable lives, those times are starting to change. Chief Hansel is growing older now, and as is custom, he must begin training his successor. This isn't as simple as one might think, since the successor is not chosen through birthright alone. Each of the children of the chief must face a trial. They must not only survive the trial, but must produce something of value from the abandoned biospheres and tubes that dot the northwestern hemisphere. Our story begins with the Chief Hansel nervously thumping the item that he had found on his trial so long ago, an ancient sawed-off shotgun that hung at his hip, and was ever-present reminder to him, pray for peace, but be prepared for war. He was nervous because there was a good chance today that he would maybe see one or both of his sons for the last time. His eyes began to water thinking of his own sister, who didn't survive the trials, He still recalls the joy of stepping through the airlock back into the biosphere only to find out that his sister had not returned. It took the tribe 4 days to find her corpse. His mother wept for a week. The chief could hear voices outside of the main office in the old prison. The single candle on his desk flickered and partially lit up the room. He stood up from the desk and walked out into the hallway. The old and grizzled shaman, Mansell, was speaking with one of the guardsmen. They both snapped their mouths shut as Hansel stepped through the doorway. "Are my sons ready?" Hansel spoke without realizing. "They are, my chief," the shaman replied. "Let us begin." In the courtyard of the prison, a large crowd was gathered. It was bright and early in the morning. The sun was just beginning to peek up over the horizon. People from all over the biosphere had come to see the two heirs off. Chief Hansel looked over the crowd before his gaze fell upon his two sons. Hannibal, the oldest living son, was tall compared to his brother. Hannibal was a skilled merchant, potentially the best in the biosphere, potentially even the best in the hemisphere. The old chief had wondered that many times before. Hannibal was wearing an expensive leather vest with chainmail sewn into it, dark red as was his liking. Beside him, with a grim face, was his brother, Masenko. Younger, smaller, and wiry, Masenko was the best archer in the biosphere, hands down. His dark, drab garb helped him blend in with almost anything. Masenko had a cut across his left eyebrow from a run-in with a bandit in one of the tubes. He was a soldier, pure and simple. Masenko and Hannibal loved one another in their own way. They always knew this day would come, yet they never once stood in each other's way. That could have been because of their eldest brother, who had died in the tubes a few years ago. They never found his body, and it tormented all of them, even the chief. The chief hadn't realized everyone was silent and staring at him. He refocused his attention on his two sons. "For a millennia, our people have survived in this God-forsaken planet by competence, strength, and determination. Even so, those who lead us must exude these characteristics. Go now, my sons. Prove your worth to the tribe. 3 days is your time limit. 3 days. May God be with you and shelter you in the dome of his grace." With that, the two men bowed, exchanged a hug with one another, and turned and started toward their pre-designated tubes. Chief Hansel's hand shook on the handle of his old shotgun as he watched them leave. So the first character that we're going to follow on this playthrough is Hannibal. Hannibal is the oldest son. He is a merchant by trade, which means that he's probably not really a fighter, but that doesn't keep him from the trials. His pre-designated gate is the Golden Rim Gate, and it's about an hour travel from High Hannock to the gate. During that time, he definitely would have been pondering on the history of the trials, why they exist, and to disclose to you guys why they exist, we'll briefly talk about it while Hannibal is walking towards the gate. Basically, it was determined that the Hannocles needed a chief that was competent and most assuredly brave. And so many, many years ago, the Hannocles came up with the idea of the trials. So the trials are basically where they send out the heirs that are still eligible, and those heirs must find something of value and survive. And from the value of the different items that they may or may not find, and whether or not they die, an heir is chosen. Prior to the trials, the heirs are not allowed to reproduce. Most of them never even court a potential suitor. A lot of this is for the simple reason that there can never be any question about how the succession will go. The trials have to decide everything, and so there can't be any children that may or may not be more eligible, and, right? Or grandchildren of the current chief. That's the primary reason for the trials. So, by now, Hannibal is starting to approach the gates. He's not particularly nervous, as he's traveled the tubes many times in his journeys as a merchant. However, he definitely feels a level of unease associated with the fact that he hasn't actually traveled this tube before. The Golden Rim Gate is known as a dead-end gate. Once 100 or so years ago, it was connected to another biosphere far, far away. Somewhere along the way, however, the connection was lost and destroyed. Now, only horrors await. Instead of passing into the large airlock of the blast doors, Hannibal approaches a small man-sized doorway beside the blast doors, which is also an airlock. He reaches out to grasp the door handle when a voice behind him wishes him good luck. It's a young woman named Cynthia. Hannibal smiles slightly at her before nodding to the airlock operator. The operator unlocks the door and Hannibal steps into the airlock. The man-sized airlock is only about a meter squared. The doorway leading out into the tube would be unlocked, but he wasn't quite ready to step out just yet. Hannibal reached into his pack and produced the breathing mask he would need to survive out here for 3 days. He had 3 oxygen tanks at his belt. The atmosphere wasn't so toxic or deadly that one would die immediately, but it also was not sufficient enough to sustain life. Fortunately, over the course of 1,000 years, the people of Thorun have been able to maintain the oxygen regeneration systems within the biosphere, and after that time they had fine-tuned the exact oxygen concentration required to sustain someone out in the tubes and beyond. For those of you that may be wondering how they've been able to keep the technology going, a lot of it revolves around constant repair of solar panels, wind turbines, things like this that feed power into the different biospheres. It's not a lot of energy, but at this point, these folks wouldn't use a lot of energy, so they only use power for very essential things. That's just a side note. Hannibal latched the hose onto the face mask and put the face mask on. He then opened the valve that would allow the oxygen to flow. The telltale, slightly cold air that he breathed now told him that the oxygen was working. Hannibal then reached over his shoulder and grabbed the spear that was holstered at his shoulder, on his back. With a twist, the spear pulled free. Finally, it was time. A deep breath. No reason to linger. 3 days is a long time. And he opened the door into the tube. The scratch-stained from age glass tunnel that Hannibal now stood in was a half-pipe shape. Ahead of him, the tube turned out of sight over the hill ahead before reappearing off in the distance on the other side of the valley that he would eventually need to travel through. The ground was paved since these tunnels were once used by vehicles thousands of years ago. Some small plants grew in the crack, but mostly the area around him was clear. Hannibal hefted his spear and strode forward. So now we are probably in the early morning, and so what we will do is, as Hannibal and any characters are traveling, I'm going to roll for encounters. So depending on the danger, I basically roll different types of dice, and then depending on what I roll, it kind of determines whether or not there's an encounter. If there is an encounter, then I then counter roll onto different other lists that I've kind of predetermined to do for the different tubes. And as we go into different regions or different areas, those lists of potential encounters will change. But this adds some randomness, some undetermined storyline to the storyline itself. And yeah, so let's get started on this very first roll. So at this point, I would need to roll a d6, and so I roll a 4, so there's no immediate noticeable encounters that occur. Hannibal is able to efficiently travel through the tube. By mid-morning, he has arrived at the first blast door. These blast doors were built to isolate different areas within the tube in the event of a tube breach. As with the entry into the biosphere, there is a large door for vehicles and a smaller one for a single man. Hannibal approaches the doorway. It is closed, which he would expect. He turns the handle and walks through. Now we're in the mid-morning time, and I'll roll another encounter, a d6. I roll a 4. As the morning progresses and lunchtime is approaching, the tube is still relatively quiet. The sun is now directly above the tube, and the temperature is starting to warm, though warm is not really a good word for it. Temperatures don't change much here on Thorun. Hannibal can see a crossroads ahead, so before he reaches it, he decides to have some lunch. Now it's lunchtime. Directly after finishing lunch, Hannibal approaches the crossroad. At this road there are two paths, straight ahead and to the left. Since his path is his own to choose, and since he has no idea where he's going, he finds a stone nearby and scuffs up one side of the stone. This side's heads. So he decides left is heads, tails is straight. He flips the stone. For this stone flip, I roll a d4. Odds are tails, evens are heads. I roll a 4. Hannibal doesn't pick up the stone and just turns down the left tube. Early afternoon. Another d6. This time I roll a 3. It becomes clear that after a time, Hannibal has chosen one of the side tubes. This isn't bad per se, only that the road and the side tubes are very cheaply made way back when. Here they are grown up in thick weeds, now block much of the path. Hannibal can no longer walk a straight path and must pick his way through the heavy foliage. Even so, he still makes good time. Late afternoon, another d6. I roll a 2. About an hour before supper, a bestial shriek reverberates through the tubes. Until this point, Hannibal has let his guard down. Shriek reminds him that there is danger here. Since it's getting dark, Hannibal is unsure whether to continue and potentially run into the creature ahead at night, or be ambushed while sleeping, or if it's better to play it safe and set up a camp early. Since we don't know Hannibal's character traits just yet, I'm going to use a d4 to determine this. If it's an even roll on the d4, he continues. If it's an odd roll, he remains where he's at. I roll the d4, and it is a 4. Hannibal hefts his spear, and he continues on. Because of there's certain decisions that as we roll, and this is sort of a side note, as we roll and Hannibal makes decisions, it will essentially begin to establish a trait pattern for him. And so eventually, if he makes enough of a certain series of decisions, it will become kind of default that his character traits will have him do these things. But since this is a new character, and since I'm not wanting to guide the character per se, I'm going to let some of the randomness kind of figure out how his different character traits are. So because of this check that we just made, I'm going to make a note in Hannibal's character sheet that it appears that he is not easily deterred from his goals. As the sun flees the horizon, Hannibal sits down to eat his supper, dried meat and oat bread. It tastes delicious. He's been pushing himself hard. He reckons he is still making good time. The thought of his brother passes through his mind, and he wonders how his brother's doing. After supper, Hannibal looks around for a decent place to hide while he sleeps. A heavy patch of weeds would provide a good hiding spot in case a creature or a person came along this way. He takes his pack off and lays his spear across his lap as he lays back against the pack. Sleep actually takes him rather quickly. So it's late night. It's probably around midnight, and let's roll for an encounter check. Because he's sleeping, we roll a d4 instead of the standard d6 I've been rolling to determine if there's any encounters. I roll a 1. A little after midnight, Hannibal jerks awake. He holds his breath, listening intently for whatever it was that woke him. Silence. He finally dares move and look around in the weeds around him. Strange. A pair of work gloves. He didn't remember those being there before. The weeds that were growing around them implied that they definitely had been there before. He quietly reached out and picked them up. Sure enough, they fit. He puts them on. Listening intensely once more, Hannibal eases back against his pack, and before long he's asleep again. Early morning. By now it's probably about 3 or 4 in the morning, I'd say. For For the most part, it's been a relatively quiet night. As the sun's about to come up over the horizon, it's probably about 6 o'clock by now. Another D4. Another 1. The sun is beginning to peek over the horizon when Hannibal jerks awake. Morning already. He holds his breath once more as he listens for any signs of someone or something approaching. Silence. He stands up, feeling the ache of his legs from the day before. He picks his pack up and slings it over his shoulder, once more keeping his spirit the ready. As he begins walking through the weeds, he stumbles across an enormous boulder in the middle of the tube. Hannibal looks up and sees a large opening in the tube above. Something flung this boulder through the tube. He bends down to inspect around the boulder and finds an ancient sword pinned beneath the boulder. Excited, Hannibal grabs the hilt and tries to pull it free. This is our first skill check. Strength and exert. Unfortunately, exert for Hannibal is a -1. The DC is 10. Hannibal rolls a 12, so it's actually an 11. He jerks the sword free. It appears to be heavily gouged from being ripped out from under the boulder, but otherwise the sword seems to like it's not in too bad shape. Now that he has it out, he can tell it's also a short sword. He turns and hacks some of the tall weeds, still sharp. He tucks it in behind his belt and eases down for some breakfast. After breakfast, he swaps his breathing hose on the second oxygen canister. Hannibal now exits into a clearing from the weeds and sees a biosphere up ahead. If he is going to find anything of value for his trial, this is going to have to be the place. He figures he should be able to get there by mid-morning. I roll a d6 to see if there's anything in his path. I roll a 3. Other than some small animals that scamper away as he approaches, Hannibal is not hindered on his path and sees nothing of interest. Mid-morning. Hannibal finally reaches the biosphere. There's some sort of ancient markings on the door, but he can't really read what they might say. Like most airlocks, there is a man door nearby. The door looks like it hasn't been used in many, many years. He is thankful for the work gloves as he now grips the rusty door handle. The handle turns, but in a difficult way, and the door isn't budging. It's a DC 8 strength check and exert check. Once more, I roll a 12. So 12 minus 1 is an 11. After a few hard shoves, the door finally begins to budge, but not without a significant amount of noise. So here's where we're actually going to stop for this episode. I know there hasn't been very much action just yet in the storyline, but I believe by now we're probably getting somewhere close to about 30 minutes in length. So I'd like to try and keep each episode to 30 minutes. In our next episode, we're going to walk into the biosphere with Hannibal, and we're going to see what sort of dangers may or may not be lurking there. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, give a comment, maybe a critique, give me some ideas on how I can do it better. And yeah, I hope you tune in for the next one. Thanks, guys.